Welcome to Vernacular Verbose, Jethro Tull podcast. My name's Joey Vetter.
My name's Eugene Manko.
Today we're taking a look at Stormwatch, released in 1979. If you enjoy the podcast and are feeling generous, you can now support us on Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/vernacularverbose. Any donations made will go right back into producing the podcast by helping us cover our editing costs. Again, that's ko-fi.com/vernacularverbose. So with Stormwatch, we come to the end of the 70s and the end of what I guess you'd call the golden era of the band. So this is kind of, I guess, famously the last album of the folk trilogy and the last album before the big split in 1980 of the band. So in that sense, it carries a lot of importance, I think, when you look at kind of the macro history of the Tull discography. What do you think, Eugene?
Yeah, it is an end of an era, and what an end it is, I must say. This is, I think it has been hinted at before, and I will say it straight up. Of the alleged folk trilogy, this is my favorite album. And we talked about this before, that the concept of the folk trilogy is debatable. And Ian himself had said that this wasn't intended to be sort of the follow-up to Heavy Horses as much as we've come to think of it as. And I think it does make sense, because it does sound very different from Songs from the Wood and Heavy Horses. But it does have folk elements.
Yeah. And
we can't really say that it's not progressive folk rock. It is still progressive folk rock. It's just the next version of it.
Yeah, I think thematically, it's a lot more wide-ranging than Songs from the Wood and Heavy Horses. And that Songs from the Wood and Heavy Horses, I think you can kind of pin down the theme very easily in just a couple words. In Stormwatch, it's a little harder to do that, I feel like. And maybe that's just a way of saying that it's not, as thematically consistent of an album, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be. But, it's a lot more wide-ranging when it goes from things like climate to just kind of general, maritime living, seaside living, that kind of thing. There's a lot of songs that are very clearly inspired by Scotland, and specifically the Isle of Skye, where Ian was living at the time. And in general, it's like you said, it's anchored in that sort of folk pastoral-ish world, but it has more of a wider berth, I guess. It's not really stuck just in fantasy like Songs from the Wood. It's not really stuck just in the home or, the pastoral farmland or whatever it would be in Heavy Horses. Instead, it's a bit more wide-ranging.
I think I would only attribute the word pastoral to Songs from the Wood out of all these works. And if we do look at these three albums as a journey, then I am imagining that with Songs from the Wood, we are starting in a magical dell full of fairy creatures and full of ye olden times, as you may say. And then by Heavy Horses, we've moved out of that fairy dell and we have entered the real world in the countryside that is connected to that notional universe of rural Britain, but which has more elements of the real world in it, which has more questions about how things work, more questions about how this world fits in with the wider world, as we've seen in like Journeyman. And by Stormwatch, we've traversed the mainland, if we can call the British island the mainland, and we've ended up on the shore with all of its heavy weather, with all of the questions about the future now. And it's not just the physical shore where land meets sea, of which we have a lot in this album, but it is also the frontier of knowledge. We're now pondering the questions to which we don't have answers, like the climate change. I think in that regard, there is a narrative between these three albums, and Stormwatch is part of that narrative. And thematically, I think it does have a theme, the theme is, you can say it's quite general, but the theme is heavy weather.
Yeah.
And we make the connection to the song Heavy Horses with that, because that is the phrase from Heavy Horses, brewing heavy weather, and that is what's happening in pretty much every song on Stormwatch. No matter what Ian is talking about in a specific song, there is always this element of the elements.
Yeah, that's a very poetic way of looking at it. I've never really thought about it that way, but I'm sure you're right. There's, I mean, certainly weather is a theme that's found throughout a lot of the different tracks, and of course with the album title itself, which isn't, it's not a title track. It's, taken from the lyrics of one of the songs and that kind of thing. So it was clearly deemed to be thematically important enough to be the title of the record.
Yeah, that's the sort of my take on this.
When I look at the album and kind of its legacy going forward until, there's a couple things that stick out to me. One thing, I'm curious if you would agree with this or not, but one of the peculiarities of Stormwatch to me has been that there doesn't really seem to be a track on this album that has had much of a life beyond the album, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yes.
It's kind of just a short way of saying there's not really any hits on this album. And I don't really mean to say that there were hits necessarily on the past couple albums either, because there kind of weren't, like commercially speaking. But I just mean, there's not really many songs, if any, on Stormwatch that I think kind of lasted in the Tull legacy afterwards. So, for example, you can look at this album like War Child, which as an album maybe wasn't super impactful, but it still had tracks like Skating Away, Bungo in the Jungle, which had very long lives in the band's career afterwards. I can't really think of any track on this album that did that. The only one I could really name would be maybe Dun Ringill, but I can't really name another one.
I would agree about Dun Ringill, and yeah, it's true that this album is kind of neglected in the Tull live sets of the subsequent years, and to me it is a great shame. I know that these days Ian doesn't really have much of a sort of track rotation in the live set. It's pretty much we know if we go to Ian's concert what is the set of tracks that the selection will be made from. But still, both times I went to see him, I kind of hoped deep in my heart, what if they play something from Stormwatch? Of course they didn't.
Yeah. Tull have always, just as kind of an aside, Tull as a live act have always been a very static band, and that, they're one of those groups that they've pretty much always played the same set list every tour and that kind of thing. Which, again, it's all to the preference of the band, but it's a shame for a band like Tull, just because they had such a huge library of stuff they could pick from, that it's kind of sad that, I think Ian's sets, to be honest, are probably a little more flexible than even Tull were at their peak, which is kind of sad. I wish that at their peak that Tull would have dug into their back catalog a lot more, because they had a lot to learn from, or a lot to use.
There are some live sets which have surprising tracks on them. Like the album Living with the Past, I think there are a couple of interesting numbers. But overall, yes, and I know that Tull musicians expressed, I think Martin, if I'm not mistaken, expressed that he was kind of dissatisfied with that they kept playing the same tracks over and over.
Yeah, definitely. One of the other things that kind of strikes me about, I guess, public opinion about Stormwatch, kind of the fan reaction, I was surprised when I sort of first became involved with, I guess, what you'd call the online Tull community, that this is kind of a fan favorite album online, from what I can see. There's a very passionate fan base for this album online. And this may be kind of skewed for me, just because when I grew up, this was another album that my parents weren't really fans of. They didn't really think it was worth bothering with much, so I sort of didn't either. And so it was kind of surprising to me to see that there was so much love for this album online. That was a little surprising. And my own opinion about it has changed too, where, from the beginning I didn't care about it much, but there's tracks on here that I've grown to appreciate a lot more over time.
That's interesting. I don't think I have noticed a lot of love specifically for this album online. Yes. It is one of my favorite Tull albums, and part of it is surely to do with priming, to do with what I heard first, and this was one of the Tull records that we had. Therefore, I grew up with this album, and it's a big part of my life.
Yeah,
and is therefore in my top Tull albums for sure. It's right there with my absolute favorites, such as Passion Play and Thick as a Brick. So we did discuss that before. Yes, the folk trilogy, the two first albums from the folk trilogy for me rank below Stormwatch, and Stormwatch is up there because maybe it's not specifically groundbreaking and genius album, but it's very dear to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a special place in my heart, and I don't think undeservedly so.
There's a couple. Well, let me say first that I'm kind of the opposite in that I guess you see the folk trilogy getting better as they go along, and I kind of see the opposite. Mm-hmm. One interesting thing about it is there's a couple of cut tracks from this album that, in my opinion, if they were on the album in place of some of the other weaker ones, they would have made the album a lot stronger. And particularly Kelpie and Stitch in Time, which are both very good songs. Mm-hmm. And then Cross Sword is also another song that came from these sessions. But it's really sad to me. I don't understand how Ian could hear Kelpie and think that that wasn't album material, because that's one of my favorite Tull bonus tracks ever. I wish that one was on here. Yeah,
that's true. Kelpie is a brilliant song. And I wouldn't mind if one of the songs on this album was replaced with Kelpie, but there's only one. Mm-hmm. or maybe two. I don't know. There are a couple. I'm not saying that this album is chock full of masterpieces. There are a couple of weaker spots, but overall, still love it. Mm. And yeah, when the remaster, the remix came out, I was very much fascinated by Orion full version.
Oh yeah,
I do understand why they decided to cut it down, but still, it's so much more prog in the full version. Mm-hmm. I absolutely loved it.
What's your opinion on the album cover?
It is not one of my favorite Tull covers, but then again, with Tull, I am not a fan of most cover art, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. I think the two album covers with Jethro Tull that I think are good works of art in and of themselves, and stand next to the great album covers in music history, I think are Passion Play and Roots to Branches.
Huh.
to be really honest.
Wow.
And the rest, I can just take them or leave them. And I think the mood of this cover really fits the album. That's what I can say. I'm not a massive fan of the sort of airbrushed art, and it kind of with the quote from Don Ringill, it seems to me a little bit busy.
Yeah.
Just like the cover of Heavy Horses, but I think I like this one more than the cover of Heavy Horses.
Yeah, it's really dramatic. Mm-hmm. Is kind of the word I would use for it, and it's kind of so dramatic that it gets kind of ridiculous, I think, on this one.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head here. If I saw a book with this cover, I wouldn't assume this was great literature. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's really kind of impressively detailed, which is cool. But for me, it's a couple, it's kind of a hodgepodge of different things. It's number one, you have, I guess a character who is obviously Ian on the front, who I don't really like again. And you have, I don't know, there's just so much about it that it seems like it's trying so hard to seem important and dramatic. And I mean, I think trying to have an important or dramatic looking album cover isn't a bad thing, but it just seems like it's trying so hard that it comes off as kind of unintentionally funny almost.
Yeah, I will agree. I don't hate this cover, but I think sort of the way the album sounds in my head, it could have had a much better cover.
Yeah. One thing that is cool about it, I like the detail with the reflection of the lightning and the binoculars. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, the oil rig in the binoculars.
The back cover is pretty cool with the polar bear and
with the absolutely giant polar bear.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up, this might be a little obscure. At Disney World in Florida, there is a ride that used to be there, but it's no longer there. But in the Epcot theme park, they have kind of a section where it's like different countries of the world with different rides and shops and that kind of thing. There used to be a ride in the Norway section that was called Maelstrom. Have you ever heard of that at all?
No, of course not.
So it was a boat ride, and this will sound weird, but I swear to God, it's almost like the people at Disney wanted to create a theme park attraction about this album. Like, that's what that ride was like. And maybe anybody listening here knows what I'm talking about if you're from the US or something. But it was because it was created in like the early 80s, kind of right around this same time. So you kind of have that late 70s, early 80s aesthetic thing going on. It was supposed to be kind of a boat ride through Nordish folklore and that kind of thing. But there's so many things about it that are so similar to this album in really weird ways There was a scene that looks exactly like the back cover of the album, where you're kind of in this frozen waste and you have this huge polar bear standing up next to you. There's a scene where you're in front of an oil rig with a thunderstorm going on, just like the front cover with North Sea oil and stuff. And that's always just been like a really weird thing that has kind of stuck to me, is like, how are there so many connections between these two completely random things? It's so funny.
Did you ever go on it with Stormwatch in your headphones?
No, that would have been a great idea, though.
Yeah, it's a shame that it doesn't exist anymore, and there's not an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, it's one of those relics of the early 80s. Musically, I mean, parts of the album, they sound kind of mournful to me. And I always thought it was kind of interesting, because it's almost like it was anticipating, the big split of the band in a way. But I mean, I don't think that was, an intention or anything. But especially with tracks like Elegy, it sounds very wistful, and it's kind of hard to disassociate that from what was about to happen in the band, I think. Yeah,
that's true. And it is also kind of fitting that John played bass on Elegy, one of the few tracks he did.
Yeah. So that's an important thing worth mentioning. In the member lineup, there's a very big change that's worth noting. So on this album, we had Ian Anderson on vocals, flute, acoustic guitar, and bass guitar for most of the tracks. Martin Barr on electric guitar, John Glasscock playing bass on only 3 tracks, Barry Barlow on drums, John Evans on keyboards, Dee Palmer on keyboards. So the basic story with John Glasscock is that his health issues were becoming so serious that he was essentially dismissed from recording by Ian, because Ian felt he wasn't well enough to do the rest of the album. And so that ended up with Ian playing bass on the majority of the album and John only playing on 3 tracks.
Yeah, I think part of the issue that John was recuperating from an operation he had.
Yeah. Which, of course, in the end, he never did recuperate from, because he died during the tour for this album in November of '79.
Yeah, he wasn't on the tour, but
right.
He died while the band was on the tour, and they had to announce it.
So as a bassist, do you have any comments on Ian's bass playing? Does anything stick out to you?
Yes, the bass sticks out to me.
Yeah.
Because I feel like on every track where Ian played bass, the bass is mixed louder.
Oh, really? I didn't notice that.
And it has more of a ringing quality. The tone is very different between Ian and John.
Yeah, the tone is clearly different to me.
Much more muted tone. And I think sort of in terms of the approach to bass, I think Ian's bass playing is totally fine, but the bass tone could use some work.
Yeah,
and I think it kind of sticks out. It's kind of blends in less than John's would. And there is a track on this one where I think the part that Ian played is very fine and very interesting. I think a couple of tracks for sure.
Mm-hmm. Track 1, North Sea Oil.
We want to be in North Sea, in North Sea.
So this is actually one of my favorites on the album right off the bat.
Good.
One of the weird things about this one is the adjective that I would use to describe the way this song sounds is tropical, which is kind of funny because obviously the North Sea is not a tropical area. It's very, cold and gray and muddy.
Very different.
Yeah. The reason I say that is the guitar, and I think specifically the guitar tone in the chorus, the North Sea, it sounds really tropical to me. I don't know, that's the way I would put it. It's very kind of like hot and sunny, and it sounds like a beach thing almost to me.
Well, yeah, when you're a sailor on a boat and you traverse the oceans, you can be in the northern latitudes and still have relics of tropical climates in your cabin.
Yeah.
That's sort of what being a sailor is all about. Of course, it's not what being an oil what do you call a person who works on an oil rig? Rigger? No. But yeah, you can. I could make a tenuous connection to an eclectic approach to the sound.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this song, well, first of all, what strikes me is the opening track to the album isn't 5/4.
Yeah.
And it's such a bold choice, and it's such a fantastic 5/4 as well, because normally the sort of standard rhythm that is chosen in music written in 5/4 is what you will hear on such as living in the past. Tagada tagada pum pam 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 pam, and that's adds a little swing, and that is Take 5 by Dave Brubeck. Right? Or if you will, everything's alright, yes, everything's alright, yes. That is the standard 5/4 that we're used to hearing in, pardon me saying so, popular music. But this track, completely different. Completely different division and completely different rhythm within that bar of 5/4. It's, I think the central rhythmic idea is what we hear before the vocals come in. Dum da dum da 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 dum dum da dum da da dum. And it is similar, if you sing it like that, it's similar to the standard 5/4 rhythm, but it has a completely different feel.
Yeah, it's very, it's a really energetic track, which I'd kind of say that there's not a lot of energetic tracks on this album, and I don't mean to conflate energetic with intense or loud or anything, but there's kind of an energy on this track that I think the rest of the album doesn't have to that degree.
Well, I'd say Something's on the Move, pretty energetic as well. Side opener, so I think they've put the high energy ones at the start of each respective side.
One thing with this song too is that it's a song that only Tull can write. Like a rock band writing a song about North Sea oil. That's just one of those things that I love about the band that you don't see anybody else doing.
Yeah, I think Ian makes a note of that in the booklet. So it's not a very standard rock and roll song topic. When looking at the harmony in this track, what I wrote down in my notes is that it irreverently skips from key to key. You could, if you like, I think, analyze it as having two keys, and where each key is kind of explored thoroughly from different sides. But I feel the point of all these key changes is to just to kick the ground from under our feet, because we're at sea. It's kind of the feeling of open sea in stormy weather, where you don't know where you are and where you end up next. And so that the kind of tumultuous feeling that the key changes lend, I think, to this song. They happen in the verse. Damn it. They happen in the verse and in the chorus, and the instrumental part is also in a completely different key to the rest of the song.
Yeah, the bridge in particular is quite kind of hard to orient yourself, and not in a bad way. That's just kind of the way it sounds. And particularly with you have kind of that like newscast or whatever it is going on that Ian is narrating.
The shipping forecast.
Yeah.
It is the shipping forecast. It is an iconic radio broadcast in Britain.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone is specifically reading that, if Ian is doing that, or if they took a recording. It's not specified in the track, but it certainly sounds like shipping forecast always sounds.
Oh, really? It sounded like it was done in the studio to me, but what do I know? There's some crazy double bass at the end, kick drum.
Yeah, pretty fantastic. And in the percussion part, what I really like in here is the lot of 30-second notes on the shakers or maracas.
Yeah.
And it switches from being maracas to being tambourine, and I even think sometimes to being hi-hat, but I'm not sure, because the tambourine blends really well with the hi-hat here. There's a switch from maracas to tambourine on the second half of a verse, and it really subtly increases the energy without actually changing the part. The guitar here in the second and the third verse the sort of guitar stabs that are happening in the background land on really, really crazy beats.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And in the coda, in the outro, there's a flute phrase that is, I think, it has either a flanger on it or it's double tracked or something happened there. It has almost a bagpipey vibe because there's actually bagpipe flourishes on that flute line. And I remember that I criticized some of the effects on the flute on Heavy Horses, and maybe not Heavy Horses, on Songs from the Wood, but this flanger or whatever it is here, this one blends really well with the guitar in a less acoustic context. I think this is more of a place for flute effects like that. The track I noticed that the track slightly speeds up by the end, so clearly not played to a click like people would do today.
Oh, I didn't notice that, but when I think about it, I can kind of see that.
Yeah, I sort of noticed that, and then I just double-checked the first verse against the last verse, and yeah, it's clearly faster. Track 2, Orion.
Orion, won't you give me a star sign? Orion, get up on the skyline.
I already mentioned that Orion full version was undeservedly cut from the album, but yeah, it's quite long, it's 9 minutes. This one, I think it's got a really nice juxtaposition of a really foreboding kind of chorus and really peaceful verses. There is a key change, but it's not as stark as you will have in North Sea Oil. There's 2 keys using a single chord as the pivot chord between the chorus and the verse, and it's kind of sparse harmonically despite having two keys used in it. And I think it just uses minimum tricks to their full effect. And of course, this is one of the 3 tracks that John Glasscock played bass on.
Yeah. I don't know. Something about this song is strange to me, and I can't really put my finger on what it is. But something about it just doesn't really sit well with me. And
really?
you mentioned that you like the juxtaposition between the kind of the heavy choruses and the quieter verses. And I mean, I don't know if that's kind of my problem with it. I think maybe it could be. It's kind of hard for me to pinpoint exactly what unsettles me about it. I think that during the chorus, or not necessarily the chorus, but the foreboding part that you mentioned, kind of the louder parts, it kind of sounds like they're really trying to be hard rock, sort of, in moments, and it comes off a little forced to me sometimes. The main thing I think about when I think about this song musically is just kind of the heartbeat pulse of the chorus, because that's a very integral part of the song. But I don't really have a lot to say on this one. It's kind of one of those songs that it kind of goes in one ear out the other for me. And I think the part I like about it the most is probably the quieter verses. I think that's probably the highlight of it to me.
Well, yeah, I will not agree, because this is one of my favorites on this album. I really love this song. I really love the mood it sets. So I welcomed the full version in the remix a lot as an extra. I don't feel they're trying too hard to be heavy, because it's not like they're having double tracked, massively distorted electric guitars. And shouting. It's foreboding enough. I think they're achieving what they set out to achieve. The verses, I think, have a lot of excitement actually in the drum part, because the drum parts are really different in between every verse in combination. There are drum parts that repeat, but not in the same order. And I think it makes it much less monotonous than it could have been. And I think Barry did an absolutely excellent job on this song.
I didn't listen to the full version. I should have done that before we started, but I'm sure I've heard it at some point, but I'm not recalling exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah, it's got a lot of extra content. It's not the same song but longer. It has extra stuff,
and that's probably another consequence of vinyl storage capacity, which if this was released 20 years later, we probably would have gotten the whole thing.
I don't know, just the kind of mood that this song creates. Even taking it into account that it's not a very high energy song for the most part, it's still kind of high energy for me by virtue of the choruses, and it's a surprisingly energizing song for the sort of low tempo music that it is.
I think one thing I can say about it is the louder parts. They do a very good job of sounding celestial, is the way I would put it.
Yeah, they do.
I think they do a good job of achieving that, which obviously I'm sure was the intention since the song is called Orion.
And I think that's kind of that's part of what makes it uplifting for me.
Track 3, Home.
Why don't you come away and let your first smile take me home?
So this is a pretty glorious song, I think. I don't know about you, but it's very much a ballad. Obviously, it's very much a power ballad. There's so many things about it that are just stereotypically ballad, even down to just the drum part and things like that. But so I mean, in a way, I can kind of understand if someone was to call it cheesy, but I don't know. It works for me. It's pretty powerful. The part I like the most is probably just how heroic the guitar sounds. You know what I mean? The da 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 da, the way it comes in is so awesome.
I think I have a little bit of an issue with this song, and I think it's the placement on the album. It kind of feels like a postscript to Orion, and it has a little less energy.
Yeah.
And in that regard, it creates a slightly low point, but not because it's a weak song, just because I think that the placement Orion into Home, I think not the best that could have been chosen. Really like the phased guitar in the verse. It's really nice. With this one, I think the drum parts could have been more exciting a little bit. It's just there's probably a little bit too much of a straight pop rock kind of drumming.
Yeah, that's what I mean with the whole ballad thing.
Yeah.
And I think, my interpretation of it is that was very much, on purpose from Barry, is that he felt that was what he needed to do on this kind of song. Because it's definitely not a traditional Barry Barlow drum part by any means.
Yeah, that is a good point. If Barry played something like that, it was because he meant it. Harmonically, is it the first Tull song that uses what is called a line cliché, which is a descending bass line over pretty much the same chord?
Oh, I know what you mean.
It's the same thing that happens in songs such as Stairway to Heaven or While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
There is one surprising chord in it, the B flat. The song is in A minor and there is a B flat, so it's just half step above, which is non-diatonic, one would say. Overall, I don't have a lot to say about this song. There is one thing. Ian refers to this song as one of his few romantic songs. It is certainly a love song, but it's interesting how the notion of romanticism is for him connected with the idea of home. It's quite a cozy song, homely, which is, if you think about the meaning of the word romantic historically, as in romantic literature, this is the opposite of a romantic theme. Right, a romantic theme is the theme of adventure, is the theme of conflict, of standing on your own against the crowd, and so on and so forth. And being all settled and cozied up at home is kind of not that.
My interpretation of the lyrics was that it's about touring, or rather returning from touring. And,
Ian writes a lot about that.
Yeah, and I think that would make perfect sense as a romantic song for a guy like Ian, especially who was married with kids at this time, that him coming home from touring, that was how he connected, of course, with his family.
Yeah, that, as early as To Cry You a Song.
Yeah.
On Benefit, we've had this theme.
It's pretty short, this song. And I really like the way the strings work in it, and I really like the ending. I love the ending chord. It's a very sweet sounding ending chord.
Yeah, the strings for sure, the synth strings are great, but so are all the strings arrangements on this album.
But yeah, I like this one. This was kind of a latecomer for me. There's a couple different tracks on here that I mean, I'm sure I knew about them, but it took me a while before I really discovered them and fell in love with them, and this is kind of one of those songs that I found later.
Yeah. I'm kind of surprised that you like it so much, but yeah, it's great. It's great that you do. Track 4, Dark Ages. Well, this one is certainly, I think, the kind of central masterpiece on the album. It's very complex, it's very long, it's got a lot going on in the story, in the music, and you've got initially a very similar juxtaposition of keys that to what happens in Orion, but there are just more of them in the entire song. More keys, more everything, more time signature changes. This is the sort of full prog, even compared to North Sea Oil.
Yeah,
I think on this one.
Yeah, we talked a bit about on Songs from the Wood and Heavy Horses how kind of each album had kind of like a dark, long, epic track, where Songs from the Wood had Pibroch. So Heavy Horses, you could say, I mean, Heavy Horses, the song, you could say was kind of like that, but I think the dark epic on that one was No Lullaby. And then this is obviously the one for this album.
Yeah.
So I don't want to break any hearts here, but to be honest, I don't have a lot positive to say about this one. So I will start with the positives first. The thing I like about it the most probably is the sound design at the beginning and a little bit at the end also. I think that does a really effective job of kind of conveying what they wanted to convey, which to me is kind of like, this is the back cover is what I picture when I hear the song, is kind of those frozen wasteland and that kind of thing. And I think they did a good job with that.
I think in the sound design, of course, the reverse reverb / delay on the vocals in the intro is pretty fantastic. There's also a sort of, I called it an icy synth on the line, jagged fires mark the picket lines. It's very cool. And there's, in the a cappella chorus, I'm hearing some kind of very high-pitched noise. I'm not sure if that is some kind of percussive addition or even an artifact of just vocals blending, but it does have an ice cracking kind of element to it, and I think it's a conscious sound design decision, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's very clear sonically that they were going for a very massive sound on this song. And you can tell just from the drums, because the drums sound huge in this song.
Yeah.
I'm sure on purpose.
And the way they enter on the switch to the 6/8 time signature, to the faster part, is just fantastic. Or the tom rolls. I think rototoms as well. Yeah,
there's a rototom fill at one point. I noted that.
So what's the problem with this song, do you think?
Well, my main problem is probably like people can expect, is I just think it's too long. And there's not, from the beginning, there's just not a lot that really interests me to the point that I want to hear it for 9 minutes. You know, I think it's kind of cool. Like, I think, especially kind of the main riff of the da-da, that's kind of cool, but I don't want to hear it that long. One part that's kind of interesting that I noticed, the March snare part, and I don't mean like it's more of like the da 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 da, that kind of syncopated part, is really reminiscent of Thick as a Brick, which I'm sure wasn't intentional, but when I heard that, it immediately made me think of Thick as a Brick with the similar drum parts there on that. Yeah,
I think just the rhythms they come up with. Yeah, I kind of expected you to not like that it's a bit long and that they repeat the first verse at the end, what they do in Heavy Horses or No Lullaby or songs like that. But, well, they just do that, right? As early as Aqualung, it's sort of a Tull thing. Yeah. We do the first verse again and then go into a loud outro kind of thing. But I think it's very well executed in this situation. The return to the first verse is pretty short, and it follows into the coda quite nicely. And this is not a No Lullaby situation where they just repeat the entire song 2 times.
Right.
This one is all clear. It's good to go. And the outro is just fantastic.
Yeah, I wanted to mention the outro because it's pretty interesting how they bring back the intro but with synths in the back. This isn't a song that I listen to very often, if ever, and I especially don't make it past the 9-minute mark usually. So listening to this album, it was kind of fun because, you know, the outro is not something I've heard very often, so hearing it again was kind of new to me and fresh.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you can compare it to No Lullaby because there's a lot of similarities, I think. But for me, kind of just what it comes down to personally is No Lullaby I actually think is quite interesting. My problem with No Lullaby is just that they repeat the entire song again, which I think they didn't need to do. With this one, there's just not a lot that really hooks me to it to begin with, so I just have kind of less interest.
No, I'm really hooked from the beginning, I think. And in this song, this song I think has one of my favorite Martin Barre solos in the break. That phrase with the tremolo arm that he does, and overall, I think for Martin's guitar tone, this is my favorite album.
Yeah, I can see that.
This is the best Martin Barre guitar tone in this across the 70s.
Yeah, the tone is a big part of a lot of songs here. I think like North Sea Oil is kind of what I was mentioning. Just the way that the tone sounds on that song is really awesome.
Yeah.
One thing that's worth mentioning, just as we're talking about this song, there's a documentary, not a full-length documentary, but kind of a short television documentary. I don't remember what the name was, if it had a specific name, but it came out in 79 or 80, and it was interviews with band members in various places on tour, in the studio, or just in their houses, different places. But it actually had some footage of what I think was the recording of this song in the studio, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do, with Ian singing, actually singing his parts.
Yeah, which is really interesting just because studio footage of Tull is extremely rare. So to see that is pretty interesting. And if anybody can find that online, I think it's kind of hard to find. It's been kind of split up into a bunch of different parts, but it's really worth looking at because it's kind of rare to find video footage from the 70s of the band in those kind of contexts.
I know what you're talking about. I've seen it, and it's really worth watching. Again, the sound design in the outro of this song, just these icy waste sounds all along the icy wastes.
Yeah.
It's just, I love it so much. Finishes the song absolutely brilliantly.
Track 5, Warm Sporran. So I like this one quite a bit. There's a very obvious, I don't know if it's Scottish or Celtic, I'm too ignorant to know what exactly that influence is, but it's very obviously kind of a take on that kind of culture and that kind of style. And I like kind of I would call it the Viking singing in the back. I know it's not Viking, but that's kind of what it sounds like to me. And I don't know, it's a weird song, but it's kind of a joyful little weird thing, and I appreciate that they went for it. I think it came out pretty well.
Yeah, I do really like this song. It is Scottish, yes, certainly, and the name kind of hints at that.
Yeah.
I love how the melody bounces between different instruments here. I think the bass part that Ian played is spectacular. I only wish that John could have played that with his ability for nuance.
Yeah, that's a good bass part.
Yeah, the bass part is fantastic. I have a lot of thoughts about just different sounds used in this one. There's a phaser on the piano.
Yeah.
Which is quite a surprising sonic choice, but it's so good. And I know what you mean about the Viking singing. It's just choir in the background just makes this track blend in with the rest of this album as an instrumental. It feels not instrumental for that reason, even though there's no words or anything. But you don't feel like you don't feel like the voice has disappeared, right?
Yeah.
Just because people are going.
Yeah, and the thing that's interesting about it is that it feels really distinct from Ian, which maybe that's kind of an obvious statement to make. But, I mean, obviously, for the huge majority of the album, the voice, your voice in this album is Ian. But on this album, it feels very separate from that. It feels like it's something very different in whatever world this album is in, which is kind of cool, I think.
It's part of... When Ian is singing on a song in this album, this is kind of a non-statement, but we've got the author's voice, right? And in Warm Sporran, which has no lyrics, it's as if the world is replying to him. They are in conversation with the world around them. I would put it like that. The amount of effects, I think, on the different instruments on this one, it makes it sort of less in-your-face folk tune. And I would argue that Stormwatch is the album where they sort of finally truly incorporated all the folk sound, all the folk elements into their own. And then, of course, they dropped it and smashed it to pieces.
Yeah.
This is the track with a stark difference between the Steven Wilson remix and the original.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
There's an additional verse in there. And it's notable for several reasons. When I first heard it, I didn't realize I was listening to a completely new piece of recording, and I thought they cut out the first note, because the melody that they play and in the section that follows, it begins on sort of from a pickup note, da 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 da, and the verse, well, I'll call it verse, the section with the accordion is just ta-da, ta-da-da-da-dum, and I thought they cut out a note, but then I realized, no, it was actually a completely new section, and it has an accordion.
Yeah, the accordion's totally new. Right?
Hadn't had since War Child. It is, and it will disappear again until, I don't know, the secret language of birds, probably. In the Tull discography. So yeah, that's a fascinating little place.
Yeah, I think it's cool. I think the accordion adds a lot to it. And of course, this one didn't come out that long ago as we're recording this. This box set came out 2019, I think. So I mean, I still remember exactly when this one came out and I got my copy. And so it's always kind of nice. I mean, well, for some people it's nice, for some people it's probably not. But for me, it was kind of nice to be listening to this album and then have something totally new and fresh that I've never heard in it before. It was kind of cool.
I think what the accordion is adding is a sonic texture similar to the bagpipes, and it adds another layer of excitement between this melody in different instruments. In the end of the track, do you think the drums are double tracked? They must be, and maybe even more than double. Yeah.
The snare is obviously overdubbed. You can hear it pretty clearly. I really like the flute solo in this song. And I especially like how it ends, because it ends very strangely. Number one, you can kind of hear the mouthiness of it, which I like that a lot. When you can, it kind of like breaks the wall between performer and recording. Yeah, and it just kind of stops for a second, then goes right back in. I kind of like how weird that is.
And overall, the drumming, I think, is very clever.
Yeah,
because it manages to combine these sort of Scottish rolls with a really funky feel.
Yeah,
so it's neither one or the other.
Yeah, I think I kind of wanted to express that, but I didn't really know how to until you said funky just now. But it actually is kind of a funky drum part, which is not something you ever really see in Tull, but it's pretty apparent. And it sounds very modern, I think. Not even just the way it's played, but just like the recording of the drums on this song, it sounds quite modern.
Yeah, so conclusion, this is a brilliant instrumental.
Yep, I like it.
Track 6, Something's on the Move.
Oh, sunshine, take me now away from here. I'm a needle on a spiral in a groove. And the turntable spins as the last waltz begins. And the weatherman says something's wrong.
I like how this song achieves kind of the feeling of movement, because it feels all of the time like it wants to run forward, but it's held back until the chorus, and the chorus just lets it run. It's got a pretty simple arrangement.
Yeah.
Compared to the rest of the album, it's more of a straightforward rock song, but it's kind of very evocative, sort of emotionally, how it feels to me. What do you think?
I don't know. This is another low point for me. And this is another one I don't have really a lot to say on. One thing that's kind of worth noting just factually about it is that this was the one song that was recorded in 78. So all of this album was recorded in a couple sessions in 79. And they took one song from some sessions in 78 for this album. So it's a little bit, I mean, the sessions are the sessions, but it's a little bit disconnected just in that sense, in that it's kind of taken from a previous session. But I don't know. It's kind of like Orion for me. It doesn't stick with me much. It just kind of goes in one ear out the other. The riff isn't particularly catchy to me, and the only thing I really notice about it is that there's a lot of cowbell on it. There's a lot of kind of like a funny application of cowbell.
Yeah, that's true. I will agree that this is not one of Tull's most exciting songs, and even to the point that it being more straightforward and more rock, it kind of reminds me of later albums, like something wouldn't be out of place on Rock Island or Crest of an Ave, you know,
Yeah.
where they, you know, started going for simpler stuff. But I think there's a lot of really crazy drums on the flute solo in this one. So I think it does, within the context of the album, what it does a good job of carrying the momentum, because it's quite energetic, it's quite propels you forward, and well, it's not terribly long.
Yeah, I could describe the chorus as, you know, propelling you. I can kind of see that.
Yeah, in contrast with the verses that have a little more of a stopping, starting
Yeah.
kind of rhythm. It is very clearly a very specific choice to create that contrast and let the chorus have the effect of being propelling. But yeah, I don't have a ton to say about this one.
Yeah, it's kind of a throwaway for me. It's not one I ever listen to.
Well, since I don't ever listen to Tull on shuffle, I listen to it every time I listen to Stormwatch.
Wow. Yeah, I shuffle my Tull stuff all the time. It's fun.
Yeah, I don't really find it enjoyable to shuffle anything. I'm the kind of old school nerd in that regard. I listen to albums. I may listen to a specific song if I feel like it, a specific piece of music, but I will not just willy-nilly shuffle the pieces of music around.
I used to know people in high school and stuff who, I mean, to me, shuffling is fine, but like I would never listen to an album that way, you know, the first time I ever heard it, you know. Like, of course, I would always listen to it front to back first. But I actually knew people in high school who, the first time they got an album, they would shuffle it. And I was like, I couldn't believe that you know, you would ever, that's like such a masochistic way of approaching music, you know.
Yeah, that's true. Well, though I think there are albums that don't really have a lot of thoughts behind the track order.
Yeah, pretty much every album put out today, I'd say. It's like that. The way that streaming has kind of changed the game with that is really sad. Track 7, Old Ghosts.
I'll be coming again like an old dog in pain, blown through the eye of the hurricane, but down to the stones forever.
This one's kind of funny. I like it overall. I think it's kind of one of the more underrated songs, but I don't think there's anything spectacular about it. I think that the best strength of this song is the chorus, because the chorus is quite powerful and I think it's pretty catchy. I like kind of the theme of it too. If you read the booklet, he mentions how there's a specific place that this song was inspired by. The graveyard in Kilmorey, Scotland, where he lived on the Isle of Skye, I think. And so I think that's kind of cool how it was inspired by an actual place out there. And the strings work pretty well in it. I really like the bass line in the song, kind of the main bass line, especially the one that's played over and over at the end. So it's nothing amazing to me, but I'd enjoy it generally. I think it's a little bit of an overlooked song. Yeah,
it's not really noticeable, I think, as Tull songs go, but yeah, I really like it. It's got one on this album. I think it's one of the more interesting bass parts by Ian, up there with Warm Sporran. Lots of interesting little things, and I like how cohesive it is. Like there is this motif in the intro, the ta-da-da ta-da-dum, and this rhythmic idea repeats throughout the song across different instruments. Not just that melodic idea, ta-da-da ta-da-dum, but just the ta-da-da ta-da-da appears. You will hear it in drums. You will hear it in bass. And that's kind of really intentional, and really it just pulls the song together. I think the delayed flute sounds really nice on this one, and it isn't often that Ian plays a two-voice part on the flute. He double tracks his flute, yes, but a two-part harmony, that's kind of new, and that kind of one of the hallmarks of this song. There's what is called in electronic music a riser, before the last instrumental break. Everything just goes and I love that moment. It's
one of the things that I think of too with the drum part, not just in this song but really on the whole album. There's a lot of China cymbal on this album, which is kind of funny because it's not that Barry never used it, but it kind of seems like throughout the folk trilogy he started using it more and more, kind of starting it with Hunting Girl. So it's a little kind of fun, innocuous thing to notice.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Maybe he thought it blended well with the style.
Yeah.
So it fitted the direction. In the outro / coda, I really like how all the instruments just get more jaunty and upbeat, but in a slightly unhinged way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly the kind of emotion they went for, but it's because of the theme of the song about old ghosts playing, and what the end of the song sounds to me is like a Dance Macabre situation.
Yeah, I can see that. So
yeah, I think very cleverly put together, and it's not a high point, but I think it sets a wonderful mood.
Yeah.
And it's emotionally a really nice song.
And lyrically, it even manages to rope in the whole climate theme thing, where they have In the Eye of the Hurricane and all that.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it's specifically a climate reference, but the weather reference for sure.
Yeah.
Track 8, Dung Ringill.
In the wee house I'll meet you, and down by the Ringill, on we'll watch the old gods play.
We've talked before that a lot of Tull albums have that little acoustic number, some albums more than one. And if I listed next to each other those songs like Cheap Day Return or Requiem or Only Solitaire and Dung Ringill, for me, Dung Ringill will be this acoustic Tull song number one, because I absolutely love it. It's at one point I think it used to be my favorite Tull song ever. Kind of surprising, like the favorite Tull song, again with no flute and no specific Tull-like things, but just the guitar work on this one, the sound, the spoken word elements, it is so brilliant. I won't say it's my favorite Tull song now, but certainly one of the best.
Yeah, it definitely deserves its place as like one of the all-time great acoustic Tull songs. If you were making, a collection of acoustic Tull, you would definitely have to include this one on there.
Yeah.
I think this, like I said in the intro, this is probably the only song on the album that had any kind of legacy afterwards. Mm-hmm, and I don't even think that it really had a strong one particularly. I don't see this one mentioned that often, especially in kind of mainstream music press and that kind of thing. But I think it achieves, what it wants pretty well. I really like the ghostly vocal effect and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the delays on it, yeah, fantastic.
The actual guitar part, it sounds very simple to me. And I mean, I'm not a guitarist, so I wouldn't really know, but it sounds like there's not a lot of complex stuff happening.
It's not that simple. I mean, it's certainly playable, but it's not obvious. And in the places where it's double-tracked, there's a lot of clever interplay between the two guitar parts. Mm-hmm. I would even say about this song, my favorite lyric on the album, this one. Just so many wonderful images. And the spoken word part, I knew that by heart very early, in life. Mm-hmm. When I first discovered this album, I fell in love with this song, and this spoken word part I just memorized.
Yeah, Francis Wilson is the guy's name. I looked that up ahead of time. So he was an actual weatherman for Thames Television, who they brought in to do this. And I don't know, I could take it or leave it. It doesn't bother me that much, but I'm not particularly wedded to it, the spoken word intro. The only thing I can really say about it, and this is just an observation, it's not a criticism, the guy sounds extremely British to my American ears, which I guess is not surprising because he's a news anchor. And I'm not, to any British listeners, I'm not saying anything about that, it's just kind of an observation, but to me he sounds extremely British, and that's kind of what my ears always pick up immediately.
I think Francis even contributed some of the text.
Oh, I didn't know that.
In this intro, yes, because Ian provided him with an idea, and Francis put it together into something that would appear to make sense in a weather broadcast context, mm-hmm. which I kind of found funny because I imagined that to be all Ian.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's it. Another brilliant little moment. But yeah, I mean, there's not a lot to discuss about this song because it's short and it's simple in the way it doesn't have a lot of complexity throughout the song, and not a lot of things change. But yeah, a masterpiece for sure.
The final chord is kind of a strange sounding chord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's a minor second between the double track guitars. So there's two notes that sound very close to each other. And they create a dissonance, but the dissonance is split between left and right. So it is not as dissonant, but it creates certainly a feel of unresolved tension at the end.
And I think most Tull fans know this, but Dun Ringill is, of course, an actual historical place on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, which I want to go there someday, but haven't. I've actually been to Scotland, but I haven't been up there yet.
Yeah, that's cool. That could be a nice trip. Around the world trip.
Yeah, you can use my...
of Tull places using
Tull
your
Google
map.
Maps.
Yes.
Yeah. There's plenty of Tull places you can do, Tull tourism in the UK.
Yeah, that could be a good idea for when the world goes out of quarantine.
Track 9, Flying Dutchman.
And be there when the Dutchman comes. Oh, you'd better be there when the Dutchman comes.
So, I'm a little bit tense on this one because I remember you mentioning, maybe off the podcast, that there's one song that you're not a fan of on this album. And I don't remember you mentioning that yet. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you say that it's this one. And the reason that makes me tense is because this is by far my favorite track on this album. So which one is it?
No, we've already gone through the songs that are the lower points for me, which were Home and Something's on the Move.
Okay, good. I'm relieved then.
So yeah, I love Flying Dutchman.
Yeah, this was one of those songs I mentioned kind of with Home that I didn't really, discover it until later. And this is a song that I'm sure I knew about this song for a long time, but for whatever reason, I never really got into it until the remix came out, so not that long ago. But this is a phenomenal song, I think. It's one of the most underrated Tull songs ever, I would actually say. And I love the lyrics. I think the lyrics are brilliant on it. It's some of Ian's best lyrics. And I just love the chorus and kind of how important and, I guess, mournful it sounds. And the thing I love the most about it is the bridge. I think the bridge is fantastic. It's kind of like the peak of folk Tull.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about this one. I think this song kind of sonically recreates the feeling of waves on the shore because it has that kind of motion. And yeah, another thing I immediately notice about it when I listen to it is the bass tone, because it's immediately so much better when John is doing it. And what I feel about this song is that it has the same model as Pibroch, actually. It has the bluesy rhythm, this kind of slow blues, with a folk part in the middle. But I think between Pibroch and then No Lullaby and then finally this song, this is the one where they made everything work.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I never made that connection, but you're right.
Yeah, I think that they kind of tried to do this sort of thing, this sort of musical idea, and Flying Dutchman is where they absolutely 100%, 1000% succeeded.
Yeah.
The folky part in the middle, it gels together with the rest of the song extremely well. I like the mandolins on it. They kind of create a frantic feeling. And yeah,
I like how the lyrics change throughout it. So, for example, kind of the main line of the song is "You'd better be there when the Dutchman comes," but at the end it switches to it's the Dutchman you will meet, or the Dutchman you will be floating out to sea. Right? Yeah. Floating out to sea, I like that.
Yeah, I also like how the outro in this one has a kind of a jam feel to it. Kind of surprising, partly because not something Tull used a lot of in this era. Yeah. So this song being quite long, and I think the second longest song on the album, it doesn't bother you, right?
No, well, I was going to mention that, like, if there's any kind of negative I can say about this song, and it's not really a strong negative, but it's not the length necessarily, but kind of the slowness of the beginning of it. I can see how it could be kind of sloggy for some people. It doesn't bother me that much, but I can kind of see how it's a bit slow, and I could see how that could be annoying at times, but it's not a big deal to me.
Yeah, well, this is the kind of rhythm that is supposed to be slow. That slow blues, the doom, doom, doom. And yeah, I think it feels slow if you want to rush. And if you want to give in to it, then it's totally fine.
Yeah.
Track 10, Elegy. I think I mentioned it before, but when I was in school and I learned to play the recorder, because flutes were hard to come by, so recorders were all I had, and I went to a teacher. This was the song, this was the piece of music that I specifically asked my teacher to write out in sheet music to transcribe. And this is the first transcription, the first sheet music I ever played. And I still have that piece, that little piece of staff paper with Elegy written out on it.
That's awesome. I remember you mentioning that on the first episode.
Yeah, obviously, famously about this song, this one, it was written by D. Palmer.
Yeah.
And not by Ian. And it's credited as such, and it is one of the famously non-Ian Tull compositions.
Of which there's very, very few.
Yeah, it certainly has a very classical, very Bach-like feel.
Yeah.
And Dee explains what actual piece of ancient music it's based on. It's called Dies Irae.
Right, yeah.
And this is a piece of music that inspired a lot of composers, not just her. And what is interesting, she makes a note of that in the booklet, it's in a major key, but it also uses what's called a line cliché, a descending bass line. But you will normally hear that in association with a minor key. And using a line cliché in major is, well, I wouldn't say unheard of, but it's certainly something that's not done very often. So that's kind of one of the brilliant strokes, and maybe what makes the melody extra wistful, the juxtaposition of it being major but also slow and kind of mournful.
Yeah, this song is about D. Palmer's father. That's who the Elegy is about, and supposedly this was written just very shortly after he died. And I think there was kind of a myth for a while that it was intended to be an elegy for the band. But it's not.
It works as such. And,
yeah, exactly.
Again, we shouldn't be confusing elegy with eulogy.
Right. Yeah.
But it works as such, and as a final piece on the final album for this band lineup, as one of the final pieces that John Glasscock played on.
Right.
It's very fitting. It's a kind of a farewell.
Yeah, that's how it's hard not to view it that way.
Even if it wasn't intended at the time, it absolutely became that in context.
Yeah. I like the second flutes that come in, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I don't know what the musical term for that is. Maybe counterpoint, maybe. But with the
they're a little bit in counterpoint, I would say.
And then the electric guitar parts are pretty soaring as you come to the end of it.
Yeah, again, quite a heroic sort of guitar. And yeah, I think it's just a little shy of becoming cheesy.
Yeah,
because that sort of classical melody on an electric guitar can very well be, but I think they managed to avoid that by some skin of their teeth.
Yeah, it kind of becomes sort of march-like as it goes towards the end.
Yeah, it does have a valedictory kind of quality to it.
Yeah, and I like how it fades out as well. I think it was a appropriate decision to have it fade out.
Yeah. There's Something's on the Move also fades out on the album, but I feel that the reason for that is that they didn't just know where it was going.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, but this one, it's supposed to fade out because this music is going away.
Right.
This is the sort of feeling that it creates.
And so it ends the album on kind of a bittersweet, wistful note, which is just so interesting because, it placed in the context of the band's history. For fans, it can feel kind of teary-eyed, but it's funny because that was, of course, not the intended context, and that context wasn't even created yet, of course, because the band hadn't broken up yet.
Yeah, that's true. But also maybe it's not that I think this, but you can also partly view it as a self-fulfilling prophecy. They made this album that sounded very final.
Yeah.
And so it could have, to some extent, facilitated the decision to call it quits with this sort of this lineup, this age of the band.
I think without a doubt there was a decision at this point to take a break, at least, take a hiatus. And that's not surprising, I guess, because you can kind of forget about it sometimes, but when you look back, they had been doing a studio album every single year since '68, which is really insane. When you just think about the output of most rock bands, it's really amazing.
Yeah. The decision to take a break, I think, would have been quite obvious with John's death and with everyone being quite at that point probably tired of touring.
Yeah.
But yes, of course, when the album was being recorded and was being put out, no one had thought that the decision will become so abrupt.
Yeah. So we've made it through the '70s, every album of the golden era of the band. So when I look at Stormwatch in retrospective, it's a strange album for me to talk about because I don't dislike it, but it also doesn't, it's kind of in a weird no man's land where it's not in the lower tier of 70s albums for me, but it also doesn't quite hit the higher ones. And my opinion has changed over time, though. It's in the positive direction, where I used to not really give any thought or consideration to it at all, but there's a couple of tracks on it now that I at least really like. I know it's very different for you, though. Yeah,
it is, because as of now, I think we went through most of my absolutely favorite Tull albums, and of course that is not surprising because most people really love this first half of Tull's discography, and Stormwatch is up there. If I don't distinguish between like you will have the topmost tier and just the top tier, then the albums will be Benefit, Thick as a Brick, A Passion Play, Minstrel, and Stormwatch.
Mm-hmm.
These are some of my absolutely favorite Tull albums, and not right next to them probably, but I think I have two more albums in the Tull discography that I really love and that I rank quite highly. We will come to them in the next half a year, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I'll briefly repeat that I do rank Stormwatch above Heavy Horses, and I rank Heavy Horses above Songs from the Wood because I have more of a connection with it.
Yeah.
And emotionally, Stormwatch works better for me. And yes, it was one of the first Tull records we had, so I did create that connection by virtue of listening to it so much. But also, this is the kind of moody, dark Tull material that I enjoy most with this band.
Mm-hmm. To kind of view the 70s in retrospective, I think I've probably mentioned in previous episodes, but for me there's a very clear top 5 for me, all of which come from the 70s, and one comes from the 60s, and for me they would be Stand Up, Thick as a Brick, Passion Play, Minstrel, and Songs from the Wood. And for me, I think I mentioned that there's really only 2 albums before 1980 that for me don't really cut it, with those being Too Old to Rock and Roll and War Child.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to kind of place Stormwatch in that category, but I think over the past couple of years as I've gotten to know it more, it's kind of moved up a bit more. And there's even some days where I think that Too Old to Rock and Roll could even move up there for me, because there really are parts of that album I actually quite like a lot. But for now, that's kind of where I leave it with the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to go to the 80s just because it's quite an under-discussed period of the band's history, I think.
Yeah, I agree. We'll have to see how much we have to say about it.
Yeah.
But certainly it is exciting because of that.
And there's a lot of different opinions about the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a lot of people, I think, who hate 80s Tull and just don't bother with it at all. But there's also some people who are, they defend a lot of what came out in the 80s and think that there's, a lot of material there that isn't discussed as much, which I hope that we can kind of provide on this podcast.
Yeah, I think our listeners can count on 2 albums from the 80s being vehemently defended by either of us.
Yeah, I can say that for sure.
So yeah, I'm quite happy that you're kind of coming around on Stormwatch because this is one of the important albums for me.
What would you name as your favorites and least favorites?
My favorites and least favorites. Well, I will say, because you, as previously stated, you don't argue with Goosebumps. My favorites will be Don Ringill, and then I'll probably say North Sea Oil, and then maybe Dark Ages as well. Least favorites, I will just say Something's on the Move, because I'm not a massive fan of the song Home, but that, as I said, is probably because of placement.
Yeah.
And not because the song is weak, because it definitely isn't.
When I sat down to think about my favorites and least favorites, there were 3 each that very easily came to me. And for favorites, they would be Flying Dutchman, North Sea Oil, and Home. And for least favorites, they'd be Something's on the Move, Dark Ages, and Orion.
Ooh, Orion, that hurts.
All right, thank you everybody for taking this trip through the golden era of Tull with us, and we hope you'll continue on with us into the 80s. I think there's a lot of really interesting discussion, not just with us, but with you guys too. Hearing your comments about the 80s, there's a lot of Tull albums in the 80s that I think don't have a lot of consensus on in the Tull community, so it'd be interesting to kind of see what you guys think in conjunction with us. So we'll see you in 2 weeks with A.
See you. Cheers.